There is something unsettling about opening an old map and seeing a name that no longer exists. Not a small village that faded with time, not a kingdom that collapsed in war, but an enormous landmass stretching across continents, labeled with a single word that seems both powerful and strangely vague: Tartary. The name appears in bold letters across maps printed in Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries. It sprawls across northern Asia, touching regions we now call Siberia, Mongolia, Central Asia, and parts of China. To the modern eye, it feels dramatic, unified, almost imperial, and that is where the suspicion begins. Because when people today search for Tartary in history books, they do not find an empire described with the grandeur suggested by those maps. They find a term, a label used loosely by European cartographers to describe lands inhabited by various nomadic groups, often referred to collectively as Tartars. There is no record of a single centralized global supercivilization called Tartaria that controlled advanced technology or monumental architecture across continents. And yet the maps remain. Ink does not lie easily. It reflects what the mapmaker believed or what they were told. So the question forms quietly at first: if Tartary was only a vague regional term, why does it appear so prominently? Why does it look so unified? Why is it gone? The human mind does not like gaps. When we see something large and bold erased from modern vocabulary, we instinctively wonder what happened to it. Empires fall, yes, but their names usually linger. Rome is still Rome in our memory. The Ottoman Empire is studied in classrooms. The Mongol Empire reshaped continents, but Tartary seems to dissolve between centuries, fading from atlases as if it never existed in the first place. That disappearance feels deliberate to some observers, even if historians explain it as a shift in geographic knowledge. In earlier centuries, European explorers had limited understanding of the vast interior of Asia. Regions beyond direct contact were often grouped under broad labels. Tartary became a kind of placeholder, a way to categorize lands that were distant and culturally unfamiliar. As exploration improved and political boundaries became more precise, the blanket term lost usefulness. It fragmented into Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, China, and other modern states. From an academic perspective, that transition is logical. From a psychological perspective, it feels like erasure. And this is where conspiracy thinking begins to take root. People encounter old maps online. They see the word Tartary dominating half a continent. They compare it with modern maps and find nothing by that name. They search textbooks and discover only brief mentions of Tartars or Mongol descendants. The absence feels disproportionate to the scale implied by the cartography. Why would something so large be reduced to a footnote? The suspicion deepens when individuals connect this disappearance to other perceived anomalies. Grand buildings constructed in the 19th century that appear architecturally sophisticated. Massive world fairs displaying ornate temporary cities. Accounts of global city fires that destroyed older structures. Each element alone has conventional explanations. Together they create a narrative that feels cinematic. An empire existed. It was technologically advanced. A catastrophe occurred. History was rewritten. The name was removed. The theory is compelling not because of hard evidence, but because of emotional resonance. There is also the linguistic factor. The word Tartary carries weight. It sounds ancient and powerful. It echoes Tartarus from Greek mythology, a deep abyss. It contains a rhythm that suggests scale and mystery. Language influences perception. When people read Tartary, they do not imagine a vague cartographic category. They imagine a civilization. Historical reality is more complex. The term Tartary evolved from references to the Tartars, a name used broadly for various Turkic and Mongolic peoples. European travelers often generalized entire populations under singular labels. Cartographers followed suit. Maps were not neutral scientific instruments in the modern sense. They were tools shaped by limited knowledge, political bias, and second-hand reports. Vast areas labeled with single words reflected uncertainty as much as authority, yet acknowledging that requires trust in historical methodology, and trust has eroded in the digital age. The internet allows anyone to compare old and new maps side by side within seconds. It encourages pattern recognition without context. When someone sees Tartary covering millions of square miles, and then sees no corresponding empire in textbooks, the simplest emotional conclusion is concealment. The more mundane explanation, that early mapmakers lacked detailed knowledge and used umbrella terms, feels unsatisfying. It lacks drama. There is also a deeper psychological layer. Modern society often feels disconnected from tangible history. Institutions shift narratives, borders change, information is revised. In such an environment, the idea that a massive civilization could be hidden does not feel impossible. It feels plausible. The mind asks, if small details in history can be debated, why not large ones? However, historians point out that there is no coordinated evidence of a unified empire called Tartaria, with centralized governance, advanced global infrastructure, or suppressed documentation. Instead, there are extensive records of the Mongol Empire, of various khanates, of Russian expansion eastward, of Qing dynasty influence in Inner Asia. These are documented in multiple independent sources across cultures. To erase a truly global empire would require rewriting archives in dozens of languages across continents. Such an operation would leave traces. Conspiracy proponents counter that history is written by victors. They argue that powerful institutions control narratives. They highlight examples where governments have concealed information temporarily. From there, it becomes a short leap to imagining something larger. But scale matters. Concealing a classified military project is different from erasing centuries of multi-continental civilization. The logistics would be staggering. Libraries, private collections, foreign archives, personal diaries, trade records, archaeological remains. A civilization large enough to dominate Eurasia would leave unmistakable material evidence. Coins, inscriptions, administrative documents, standardized architecture identifiable across regions. Instead, what we find are diverse cultures, languages, and political entities that historians already study extensively. Still, the emotional pull remains strong. Part of that pull comes from aesthetics. Old maps are beautiful. Decorative cartouches, sea monsters, elegant calligraphy. When Tartary appears in ornate script, it feels authoritative. The artistry reinforces perceived legitimacy. Viewers forget that these maps often contained inaccuracies alongside artistry. California was once depicted as an island on many European maps. That did not mean cartographers were hiding the truth about its connection to the mainland. It meant knowledge evolved. Another driver of belief is the human attraction to hidden knowledge. To believe that one has uncovered a suppressed truth provides a sense of empowerment. It transforms passive consumers of history into active investigators. Discovering Tartary on an old map feels like finding a secret overlooked by institutions. That emotional reward strengthens commitment to the theory. There is also a cultural undercurrent of distrust toward academic authority. When experts dismiss the Tartaria Empire theory, some interpret that dismissal as defensiveness. Instead of seeing correction, they see confirmation of suppression. This feedback loop is common in modern conspiratorial ecosystems. Refutation becomes evidence of cover-up. Yet when we examine the actual historical usage of Tartary, a different picture emerges. European writers use the term inconsistently. Sometimes it referred broadly to lands inhabited by Tatars. Sometimes it was subdivided into Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, or Independent Tartary. These were geographic descriptors, not proof of unified governance. As Russian expansion into Siberia progressed, and as European diplomacy with Asian states increased, cartographers gained more precise information. Labels became specific. Tartary gradually disappeared not because it was erased, but because it was replaced with clearer political names. This process is not unique. Consider how the term Persia shifted to Iran in international usage during the 20th century, or how Siam became Thailand. Names evolve as political identities change. The disappearance of a label does not necessarily imply the disappearance of a civilization. Often it reflects administrative refinement. Why then does the Tartaria idea persist so powerfully? Because it offers a narrative of grandeur lost and truth suppressed. It suggests that the world once contained an advanced society whose achievements were deliberately hidden. That narrative appeals especially in times when people feel disillusioned with modern systems. It reframes history as a mystery to be solved rather than a curriculum to be memorized. There is also the architectural argument often woven into Tartaria discussions. Some claim that grand 19th century buildings across America and Europe appear too sophisticated to have been built with the technology of the time. They point to ornate domes and massive stone structures and ask how a supposedly young nation could construct them so quickly. They connect these buildings to Tartaria, suggesting they were inherited rather than built. However, extensive construction records, photographs, and engineering documents exist for these structures. Industrial-era techniques, large labor forces, and advances in steel production made such architecture possible. What appears impossible at a glance becomes understandable when examined through documented history. Still, the suspicion lingers because complexity is harder to grasp than mystery. It is easier to believe that a hidden empire built everything than to study decades of incremental engineering progress. It is more emotionally satisfying to imagine a reset of civilization than to accept gradual development. Conspiracies compress complexity into dramatic arcs. When people say history erased Tartaria, what they often mean is that modern narratives feel incomplete. They sense gaps. They perceive inconsistencies between old maps and new terminology. They connect unrelated anomalies into a cohesive story. The human brain excels at pattern formation, sometimes at the expense of nuance. That does not mean curiosity should be dismissed. Questioning historical transitions is healthy. Examining how cartography evolved is valuable. Understanding why terms like Tartary appeared and disappeared reveals much about European perspectives on Asia. But moving from inquiry to certainty of suppression requires evidence that extends beyond aesthetic intrigue. The belief that Tartaria was erased thrives in digital spaces where images circulate without context. A cropped map labeled Tartary. A photograph of an ornate building. A timeline of city fires, each piece presented without broader explanation. The mind fills in the rest. In reality, Tartary was not a secret empire removed from textbooks. It was a cartographic convenience reflecting limited geographic knowledge and broad ethnographic labeling. As knowledge improved, the term faded. That fading can feel mysterious, especially when viewed through modern eyes disconnected from the mapping practices of earlier centuries. Yet the persistence of the theory reveals something profound about our relationship with history. We crave narratives that challenge official accounts. We are drawn to stories of hidden worlds beneath the surface of accepted truth. Tartaria becomes a canvas onto which broader anxieties are projected. So when someone asks why people think history erased an empire called Tartaria, the answer lies less in lost archives and more in human psychology. Old maps create visual authority. Disappearing names create tension. Distrust of institutions amplifies doubt. Architectural grandeur fuels imagination. Together they form a story that feels too dramatic to ignore. The real mystery may not be whether Tartaria existed as a hidden empire. The real mystery is why the idea resonates so deeply now. What does it say about our era that so many are willing to believe entire civilizations can be wiped from collective memory? Perhaps that question reveals more about us than about the past. And as we move forward, the investigation shifts, not just into maps and monuments, but into the forces that shape belief itself. When the maps are not enough to convince someone that something has been erased, they turn to stone, because stone feels harder to fake than ink. Buildings stand where maps can be redrawn, and for many who believe in a lost empire called Tartaria, architecture becomes the strongest emotional evidence that history is incomplete. Walk through almost any major city built or expanded during the 19th century, and you will find structures that seem almost impossibly grand. Massive domes rising above government halls, ornate columns carved with extraordinary detail, train stations that look like palaces, exhibition halls built for world fairs that appear to rival ancient Rome in scale and elegance. For someone encountering these images online without context, the question feels immediate and powerful. How did people in the 1800s build this so quickly? That question becomes the seed of suspicion. Supporters of the Tartaria erasure theory often point to buildings constructed between 1850 and 1950. They highlight photographs of elaborate capitol buildings, courthouses, opera houses, and exposition palaces. They argue that such sophistication suggests inheritance rather than construction. In their narrative, these buildings were not built by 19th century workers, but were remnants of an advanced civilization whose origins predate official records. The emotional logic works like this. The 19th century is popularly imagined as a time of horse-drawn carriages, primitive machinery, and limited engineering knowledge. If that mental image is accepted, then towering neoclassical architecture appears out of place. It feels too refined, too mathematically precise, too monumental for what people imagine as a developing industrial society. But that mental image is incomplete. By the mid-19th century, industrial technology had already transformed construction. Steam-powered cranes, advanced brick kilns, standardized steel production, and organized labor systems allowed for rapid building on a scale that would have astonished previous generations. Railroads transported heavy materials efficiently. Detailed architectural plans were drafted using refined mathematical techniques. Engineering schools were producing trained professionals capable of executing complex designs. However, the visual contrast between ornate architecture and modern glass skyscrapers creates cognitive dissonance. Many contemporary buildings favor minimalism, smooth surfaces, functional lines, less decoration. When people compare that to the elaborate detailing of 19th century structures, they assume that older buildings required more advanced skill. In reality, architectural styles change according to taste and economic priorities, not technological limits. Still, suspicion grows stronger when considering world fairs. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, international expositions were constructed in astonishing time frames. Entire temporary cities appeared within a few years. White plaster facades, domed exhibition halls, grand avenues. Photographs of these events look almost mythical. The buildings seem permanent, ancient even, despite being constructed from lightweight materials like stuff and timber. To someone encountering those images without context, it can feel impossible. How could such cities be erected so quickly? If they were temporary, why make them so beautiful? And if they were truly temporary, why do some structures resemble surviving classical monuments? This is where the Tartaria theory connects architecture with the idea of reset. Proponents suggest that these fairs were not showcasing new construction, but rather displaying inherited remnants. They argue that governments staged exhibitions within already existing advanced structures and later demolished them to conceal evidence of a previous civilization. In this narrative, demolition becomes proof of erasure, but documented records tell a different story. Architectural drawings, contracts, material invoices, construction photographs, newspaper coverage, and personal diaries detail the planning and building of these fairs. The speed of construction was made possible by prefabrication techniques and temporary materials designed for spectacle rather than permanence. Many fair buildings deteriorated quickly because they were never intended to last. Yet the theory persists because photographs flatten time. A black and white image of a grand exposition hall does not reveal whether its columns are marble or plaster. It does not show scaffolding or structural reinforcements. It presents a finished illusion. Without reading archival documentation, the image alone can inspire awe and doubt. Another argument frequently raised involves advanced infrastructure, such as elaborate underground systems, ornate train terminals, and large civic buildings in relatively young cities. The claim is that frontier settlements could not possibly have generated the wealth or expertise required to build such monuments. Therefore, the buildings must have been inherited. This reasoning underestimates the economic explosion of the industrial age. Cities grew at unprecedented rates. Wealth accumulated rapidly through railroads, mining, manufacturing, and trade. Civic pride motivated monumental construction. Immigrant labor provided workforce capacity. The scale of 19th century growth often surprises modern observers because it unfolded faster than our simplified historical summaries suggest. There is also a misunderstanding about architectural continuity. Many 19th century buildings were consciously designed to emulate ancient Greek and Roman styles. Columns, domes, pediments, these were deliberate references to classical civilizations. Architects studied classical texts and proportions. They aimed to evoke legitimacy and stability by borrowing from antiquity. To someone unfamiliar with architectural history, such mimicry can look like direct inheritance rather than stylistic revival. Yet within the Tartaria narrative, stylistic revival is reframed as evidence of origin. The argument becomes circular. If a building looks ancient, it must be ancient. If it is officially dated to the 1800s, that date must be false. This leads to another psychological mechanism at work. Once a person accepts the premise that a hidden empire existed, every anomaly becomes supporting evidence. Ornate ceilings, massive stone foundations, unusual symbols carved into facades, all are interpreted through the lens of suppression. Alternative explanations are dismissed as part of the cover-up, but architecture leaves paper trails. Construction projects involve contracts, payrolls, engineering calculations, procurement of materials. These records exist in archives across the world. They are not isolated within a single institution that could easily alter them. For the Tartaria erasure hypothesis to hold, thousands of independent records across nations would need to be fabricated or modified consistently. The logistical scale of such coordination is immense, yet belief does not require logistical plausibility. It requires emotional coherence. The idea of inherited architecture also intersects with another recurring theme in Tartaria discussions, the mud flood concept. Some claim that buildings appear partially buried, with windows below current street level. They interpret this as evidence of a catastrophic event that covered older cities in sediment, leaving only upper stories visible. In this narrative, 19th century society did not build these structures but excavated and repurposed them. However, historical urban development offers simpler explanations. Street levels were often raised to improve drainage or install sewer systems. As cities expanded, sidewalks were elevated, leaving former ground floor windows below grade. Photographs and engineering documents from many cities confirm this process. It may look mysterious today, but at the time it was a practical response to environmental conditions. The tension arises because people encounter visual evidence without contextual explanation. A basement window sitting below sidewalk level can appear as a buried first floor. Without knowledge of street-raising projects, imagination fills the gap. There is also an aesthetic factor. 19th century architecture often possesses a romantic quality absent from many modern designs. Intricate ornamentation required skilled craftsmanship. stone carving, plaster molding, ironwork. Today, such detail is expensive and time-consuming. Contemporary construction prioritizes efficiency. When people see older buildings that appear more beautiful than many modern ones, they assume lost knowledge. In reality, priorities shifted. Mass production and economic pressures changed architectural taste. Why then does the Tartaria architecture narrative resonate so deeply? Because it reframes beauty as evidence of forgotten greatness. It suggests that humanity once achieved higher levels of harmony and sophistication, only to lose them. That story appeals to those who feel modern society has declined culturally or spiritually. The hidden empire becomes a symbol of lost potential, but symbols are not proof. The documented history of 19th century architecture is rich and detailed. Architects left treatises, builders documented techniques, photographers captured construction in progress, newspapers reported on groundbreaking ceremonies and opening events. These sources exist not in a single archive, but across libraries, museums, and private collections globally. They align in chronology and detail. This does not mean every aspect of history is perfectly recorded. Gaps exist. Misattributions occur. Some buildings incorporate reused materials from older structures. Cities evolve in layers, but the existence of reuse does not equate to the existence of a global erased empire. Ultimately, the architectural argument for Tartaria rests on a sense of visual disbelief. It feels impossible that people without modern technology could create such grandeur, yet when examined through the lens of industrial capability, global trade networks, and organized labor systems of the 19th century, the impossible becomes plausible. The deeper question is not whether those buildings were built in the 1800s. The deeper question is, why so many are inclined to doubt it. Perhaps it reflects a broader discomfort with rapid historical change. If cities could transform so dramatically in a century, what else might shift beyond recognition? Perhaps it reflects nostalgia for perceived lost craftsmanship, or perhaps it reflects a longing for mystery in a world saturated with information. Architecture stands as the most visible pillar of the Tartaria erasure theory because it is tangible. You can walk into a 19th century courthouse and feel the weight of stone above you. That physical presence makes the alternative explanation feel more solid than abstract cartographing debates. But physical presence does not automatically validate hidden origin. It validates craftsmanship, ambition, and economic capacity, and the 19th century possessed all three in abundance. Still, for those who believe, every column whispers of inheritance, every dome suggests forgotten engineers, every basement window hints at buried epics. The narrative continues because it satisfies an emotional hunger for rediscovered grandeur, and as we move